My son, Rick, shoved the contract in my face during the blizzard, putting a price on my life in exchange for my husband's land. He thought I would die in fear, but he was wrong. A mother's fury is colder than a Montana winter. That was the moment the truth was laid bare, naked and cruel. But this awful story didn't begin with betrayal. It began with my love and my trust, with the promise of a pretty little house under a wide open sky, a dream I paid for with everything I had. It began with hope, the most beautiful and dangerous thing a person can have. But before I tell you how it all happened, do an old woman a favor. Please click that like button or leave a small comment, just so I know I'm not just talking into the darkness tonight. It helps, more than you know. It all started, as so many foolish dreams do, with a picture in a magazine. It was a travel magazine, one of those glossy ones filled with places you never think you'll actually see. Rick had brought it over to my apartment one Tuesday afternoon. He spread it open on my small kitchen table, right next to my cup of tea, his finger tapping excitedly on a 2-page photo of Montana. The sky in the picture was a shade of blue so vast and pure it almost hurt to look at, stretching over mountains capped with brilliant white snow. "Look at this, Mom," he'd said, his voice brimming with an energy I hadn't heard from him in years, not since before the recession hit and took his job with it. Fresh air, peace and quiet. No more city noise, no more sirens. You'd have your own little house, a real garden, and we'd be right there on the property to take care of you. I looked up from the impossible blue sky in the photograph and into my son's eyes. In their depths, I saw a reflection of a life I desperately wanted, a family made whole again. After my husband John passed away, the 2-bedroom apartment we had shared for 40 years had started to feel like a cavern. The silence was a physical presence, echoing in rooms that were once filled with the sound of him turning the pages of his newspaper, the low rumble of his favorite PBS documentary, his quiet, steady breathing in the night. The loneliness was a weight I carried with me from room to room. I ached for the sound of my grandchildren's laughter filling a home, for the simple, grounding joy of sinking my hands into dark, rich soil and coaxing life from it. I imagined planting the zinnias and marigolds my mother had loved, their bright, cheerful faces turned toward the sun. Sarah, my daughter-in-law, sat beside him, a study in sincerity. She reached across the table and covered my hand with her own. Hers was cool and smooth. "We love you, Margaret," she'd said, her voice as sweet and thick as honey. "We just want what's best for you. We worry about you here, all alone." Her words, Rick's excitement, that picture of the endless sky, it was a perfect storm of hope that swept away all my reservations. I sold the apartment, the place where I brought my baby boy home from the hospital, the place where I nursed John through his final illness, the place where every wall and corner held a memory. I packed up a lifetime into a handful of boxes and wrote them the check from the sale, the largest check I had ever written, without a single moment of hesitation. I trusted them. With everything I had, I trusted in that beautiful, glossy dream. The drive to the farm was long, a slow, silent unraveling of the world I knew. I sat in the back seat of their SUV, the city skyline shrinking in the rearview mirror until it was just a gray smudge against the horizon. I was clutching a small potted fern on my lap, a final living piece of my old balcony garden. It felt like the only familiar thing in a rapidly changing universe. Outside the window, the dense tapestry of the city gave way to the sprawling, identical houses of the suburbs, which in turn dissolved into the vast open plains of the heartland. The sheer emptiness of the landscape was both beautiful and intimidating. A sense of unease, quiet as a shadow, began to creep into the edges of my excitement. I tried to push it away. I tried to make conversation a few times, asking about their plans for my future garden, what vegetables we might plant come spring. Rick's answers were short, clipped monosyllables, his eyes glued to the hypnotic white striped ribbon of highway stretching out before us. He had a tension in his shoulders I hadn't seen before. Sarah had her headphones in, the tiny white buds stark against her dark hair. Her face was illuminated by the cool blue light of her phone, her thumb scrolling endlessly. She was in a world of her own, a million miles away from the woman and her son in the same car. The air inside grew thick with a strange, unspoken tension, nothing like the joyful, chattering anticipation of a family embarking on a new life together. It felt strained, brittle. I tried to soothe the rising knot of anxiety in my stomach. They're just tired from the long drive, I told myself. The stress of the move is getting to them. It will be different when we get there. The steady drone of the engine was a monotonous lullaby, and eventually, despite my unease, I drifted into a restless sleep. In my dreams, I saw my little house. It was just as Rick had described. Its windows glowed with a warm, welcoming light, and a gentle plume of smoke rose from its stone chimney, a promise of warmth and comfort within. I didn't know then that it would be the last time I'd feel that kind of warmth for a very, very long time. We arrived as dusk was bleeding across the sky, painting the clouds in shades of bruised purple and angry orange. Rick pulled the car to a stop, the crunch of gravel under the tires the only sound. He cut the engine, and a profound silence descended. I looked out the window, expecting to see my cozy cottage. Instead, my eyes fell upon a dilapidated structure, its wooden plank walls weathered to a silver gray, its corrugated tin roof streaked with angry orange rust that mirrored the sunset. A cold knot of dread formed in my stomach. "Where's our house, honey?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper, already fearing the answer. Rick gestured toward the wreck, deliberately avoiding my gaze. He wouldn't look at me. "This is it, Mom. Your little house just needs a little fixing up, and it'll be fine." The air left my lungs in a silent whoosh. My throat felt tight, as if a hand were closing around it. That wasn't a house. It was an old, forgotten tool shed, a place for shovels and spiders. Sarah, with an almost theatrical sigh, pulled open the groaning, creaky door. The movement revealed a damp earth floor and unleashed a musty, cloying smell of mold and decay that struck me like a physical blow. There were no sunny windows to look out of, only narrow, jagged gaps between the warped wallboards where the wind could knife its way through. My dream, that beautiful, glossy dream from the magazine, shattered into a million pieces right there on that patch of dirt. I stood frozen beside the car, the potted fern in my hands suddenly feeling impossibly heavy, its green leaves a mockery of the life I had imagined here. Through the ringing in my ears, I heard Sarah whisper to Rick, her voice low, but sharp enough to cut through the evening air. "She doesn't look happy." Rick's reply was a low growl, laced with an irritation that chilled me to the bone. "She'll get used to it." They moved with a brisk, impersonal efficiency. An old, stained mattress was thrown onto a metal frame in one corner. A wobbly card table was set up beside it. Then they left in a hurry, mumbling something about needing to unpack their own things at the main house. I was left alone, perched on the edge of the lumpy mattress as a thick, suffocating darkness settled in around me, a darkness deeper than just the absence of light. The wind began to pick up, howling through the cracks in the walls with a mournful, wailing sound, like the ghosts of all my buried hopes. I pulled my thin coat tighter, but the chill seemed to emanate from the ground itself, a damp, penetrating cold that seeped deep into my bones. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be the place I was supposed to live out the rest of my days. My voice was a thin, reedy thing in the vast emptiness when I called out his name. Rick? The only answer was the lonely cry of the wind. From the main house, a comfortable distance away, I could see the warm yellow squares of their windows. I could hear the faint, muffled sound of their laughter, the tinny noise of a television. They were in the warmth, in the light, surrounded by the life I had paid for, while I was here, in the cold and the dark. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't even lie down. I just sat and stared into the impenetrable blackness, listening to the strange, unsettling sounds of the countryside, and for the first time in my 68 years of life, I was truly deeply afraid of my own son. The next morning, the world outside the shed was painted in the crisp, clear light of a Montana dawn. It did little to warm the chill inside me. As I was unpacking the few personal belongings I'd managed to bring in my small suitcase, I opened the last cardboard box. Inside, nestled among some old, soft linens, was my mother's Bible. Its black leather cover was worn smooth with the touch of her hands in mine, the pages inside yellowed and soft as cloth at the edges. A familiar comfort, a scent of home and history seemed to radiate from it. I opened it, my fingers finding their way to Psalm 23, as if by instinct. The words were a balm to my raw spirit, the same words my mother used to read to me when I was a child, with a fever, her calm voice a lighthouse in a sea of confusion. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. My hand trembled as it traced the familiar printed verses. In that moment, the book was more than just an object. It was a promise, an anchor in a world that had suddenly come unmoored. It was a physical testament to the faith that had carried my family through generations of hardship, through depressions and wars and losses of every kind. I clutched it to my chest, inhaling the faint, sweet scent of old paper and time itself. God wouldn't abandon me, I told myself, repeating it like a litany. No matter how bad things seemed, I still had my faith. I had no idea how profoundly that faith was about to be tested, stretched to its very breaking point. Sarah came in later that morning, a bright, false smile plastered on her face that didn't come close to reaching her cold, watchful eyes. "Good morning, Mother Margaret. Did you sleep well?" The question was so absurd, so dismissive of the reality of the cold, dark shed, that I didn't even grace it with an answer. Her gaze swept around the space, a flicker of something, disdain perhaps, in her eyes before they landed on my purse, which was sitting on the wobbly card table. "You know, Mom," she said, her voice dripping with a practiced, cloying sweetness, "to make it easier to handle the household expenses, why don't you let me hold on to your Social Security and bank cards? It's just a hassle for you to worry about bills and things. You won't really need cash out here anyway. We'll take care of everything." Her logic, on the surface, that seemed so reasonable, so considerate. In my state of shock and emotional exhaustion from the events of the last 24 hours, I couldn't think clearly. My mind felt like a fog. I numbly reached into my purse and handed them over, The card for the Social Security deposits I had earned over a lifetime of work. The debit card linked to the account that held the last of the money from my apartment sale. She took them with a swiftness that was almost predatory, her fingers closing around them before she smiled again. A quick, tight smile of possession. "Thank you, Mom." As she turned to leave, I caught a fleeting, triumphant glint in her eyes. A shiver, cold and sharp as an icicle, ran down my spine. I hadn't just given her pieces of plastic. I had given her my independence, my last vestiges of control over my own life. My Sunday morning ritual for over 30 years had been a phone call to Martha, my best friend since we were giggling teenagers in high school. Our calls were a weekly touchstone, a rambling, comfortable conversation that could last for hours. We talked about everything and nothing, from the perfect recipe for a tender apple pie to whether the new Skechers she bought were as comfortable as the catalog claimed. It was a lifeline to a world where I was known, where I was more than just a problem to be managed. But that first Sunday on the farm, when I picked up the old rotary phone they'd installed in the shed, my heart full of the need to hear a friendly voice, there was only a dead, hollow silence on the line. I clicked the receiver up and down. Nothing. I tried again and again, dialing her familiar number from memory, but it was no use. When I found Rick later, tinkering with an old tractor, I asked him about it. He didn't even bother to look up from the engine. "Oh, I had it disconnected," he said, his voice casual, as if discussing the weather. "It's an unnecessary expense. If you need to say something, you can just tell us." His words hit me like a splash of icy water. That phone wasn't just a machine. It was my connection to my life, to my past, to the friends who were my chosen family. They hadn't just cut a wire. They were methodically, deliberately building the first wall of my prison. I walked back to the shed, my legs feeling unsteady. I stood in the doorway and looked out at the vast, empty landscape, desperately holding up my old, outdated cell phone. The screen just showed a single cold phrase: "No service." The world had gone silent. A few weeks later, the first bank statement was supposed to arrive. I was used to balancing my own checkbook down to the penny, a habit ingrained from my years as a head nurse where precision was a matter of life and death. I needed to see the numbers, to understand what was happening with my money. I waited for the mail truck each day, but the statement never came. Finally, I asked Sarah if she'd seen it. She let out a little tinkling laugh, waving a dismissive hand as she watered a hanging plant on the porch of the main house. "Oh, Mom, you don't need to worry your pretty little head about that stuff anymore," she said, her tone the one you might use on a child. "Your pension check is deposited directly into our joint account now. It all goes toward the house, the electricity, the water, all the food. It's much simpler this way." She said it so casually, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. But for me, it was another profound, dizzying shock. That money was my life's work, my security, the tangible result of 45 years of long shifts and aching feet. Now, it was just numbers in an account I would never see, controlled by a woman who looked at me with cold indifference. I had become a boarder in my own life, living on their charity, doled out in meager portions. Whenever I needed something small, something to feel human, like a skein of yarn to knit a sweater for a grandchild I was never allowed to see, I had to ask. The request was usually met with a shake of Sarah's head and a theatrical sigh. "The budget is a little tight this month, Margaret." The loneliness became a physical ache, a constant dull pressure in my chest. I craved the sight of other faces, the simple pleasure of a walk through a town, the quiet, anonymous company of strangers in a library. I gathered my courage and broached the subject with Rick one afternoon. He was repairing a fence post, his movements sharp and angry. "Maybe you could drive me into town this weekend?" I asked, my voice small. "I'd just love to browse the books at Barnes& Noble for a little while." He rounded on me, his face tight with irritation, a hammer clutched in his hand. "Don't you see how busy we are, Mom? We have a whole farm to run. You're already a burden. Don't start making demands." The word burden hung in the air between us, sharp and poisonous. A burden. I, who had changed his diapers, who had stayed up all night with him when he had a fever, who had packed his lunches and cheered at his ball games and walked him to his first day of school. Now I was a burden. His refusal wasn't about being busy. I knew that with a sudden chilling certainty. It was about keeping me here, isolated and invisible, where I couldn't talk to anyone, couldn't tell a single soul about what was really happening on this remote, lonely Montana farm. Without a phone, without the internet, without any trips to town, my world shrank until it was no bigger than the four walls of that shed. My only flicker of connection to the life I once knew was the daily arrival of the mail truck, a distant plume of dust on the gravel road. I would watch for it, my heart filled with a desperate, foolish hope for a letter from Martha or my cousin in Florida. But Sarah, always vigilant, always got to the mailbox first. She would sort through the envelopes on the porch, a queen surveying her domain. She would hand me only the junk mail, the colorful, useless flyers and catalogs. I knew she was hiding the personal letters. I saw an envelope with Martha's familiar, loopy handwriting one day before she quickly slipped it into her apron pocket. I tried to protest, but she just gave me a cold, flat stare and said, "I'm just protecting you from any bad news, Mom. You don't need the stress." Their control was absolute, a finely woven net that covered every aspect of my existence. They controlled my money, my communication, and now my information. I felt like a bird in a cage with no visible bars, but one built of distance and silence and 1,000 suffocating lies. Sometimes I would just sit for hours, staring through a crack in the wall at the cars on the distant highway, tiny, silent specks of freedom, and I'd imagine a world where I still belonged. On nights when the gnawing hunger and the deep, seeping cold kept me awake, my mind would drift back in time. I remembered the stories my father, a man of quiet strength and deep integrity, used to tell about the Great Depression. His family had lost everything, their farm, their savings, but they never lost their dignity. They still had each other. "Money comes and goes, Margaret," he always used to say, his voice a low rumble. "But family and honor, you hold on to those, no matter what." I thought then about the more recent recession, the one in 2008. I remembered the sheer, animal panic in Rick's eyes when he lost his engineering job, the way the financial strain had gnawed away at his confidence, at his very sense of self. I started to wonder if that was the root of all this, his and Sarah's insatiable, desperate greed. Was it born from a deep, terrifying fear of poverty? A fear so powerful it had twisted my son, my kind, gentle boy, into someone who would trample his own mother for a feeling of financial security. This flicker of understanding, this psychological deep dive into his motives, didn't lessen the pain. If anything, it deepened it. It made the betrayal more tragic. I wasn't just being tormented by a monster, I was being tormented by a son who once had a heart that was now choked and poisoned by fear. I knew I couldn't confront them directly. I was weaker, physically and emotionally outmatched. They held all the cards, but I could not, would not, let them crush my spirit entirely. So I began a small, silent act of rebellion. Every morning, with a damp rag I kept hidden, I would clean the single, small, grime-covered pane of glass set high in the shed wall. It wasn't about seeing out more clearly. The view was only of a barren field and the indifferent sky. It was a ritual. It was a quiet, determined declaration that this was still my space, that while they might control everything else, they couldn't take this small, deliberate act from me. I would wipe away the layers of dust and dirt with meticulous, focused care until the glass was clear, until I could see my own faint, distorted reflection in it. The face of an old, tired woman, yes, but in her eyes there was still a spark, a flicker of defiance that hadn't been extinguished. It was my way of reminding myself, in the face of their attempts to erase me, that I still existed. I've always taken a quiet pride in my cooking, especially my mother's recipe for chicken and dumplings. It was more than just food. It was comfort in a bowl. It was the taste of love and memory. One afternoon, feeling a desperate need to feel useful, to be something other than a burden, I ventured into the main house. Sarah was at the kitchen island, tapping away on a sleek tablet. I cleared my throat. I was thinking, I began, my heart fluttering with a fragile of foolish hope. I could make a nice dinner for everyone tonight. My chicken and dumplings. Sarah looked up, a condescending smirk playing on her lips. She didn't even try to hide it. Oh, that's sweet, Mom. But we're doing keto now. Your old-fashioned food is full of carbs and gluten. It's really not healthy. She turned to Rick, who was walking through the room, a triumphant look on her face. See, I told you. Rick just shrugged, not even making eye contact with me. Her dismissal wasn't just about food. It was a clean, sharp, invisible knife for soul, gutting my heritage, my love, everything I poured into those familiar, comforting meals. I stood there in the middle of their sleek stainless steel kitchen, a room that felt as cold and sterile as an operating theater, and I felt like a relic, a fossil from a bygone era, as outdated and useless as my cherished, handwritten recipes. The farm had a small, neglected vegetable patch near the back of the property. One look at the sad, stunted tomato plants, their leaves yellowing and curled, and I knew what was wrong. They were starved for calcium, a simple fix my father had taught me decades ago. Later, I saw Rick standing by the garden, frowning at the pathetic plants. I approached him gently, offering a piece of my world, a piece of my knowledge. You know, son, I said softly, if you crush up some eggshells from the kitchen and mix them into the soil around the roots, it helps. Your father used to swear by it. He didn't even turn his head to look at me. Mom, it's not the old days. We have the internet now. There's an app for everything. He held up his smartphone as if it were a shield, a barrier against my antiquated wisdom. His words slammed a door in my face, locking me out of his world. A lifetime of practical, hands-on experience, the little bits of knowledge passed down from my parents, all of it rendered obsolete by a glowing screen. I wasn't just a physical burden. My mind, my experience, my very wisdom, it was all trash to be discarded. It was in that moment that I truly felt invisible, a ghost from a past they were actively trying to erase. Soon, the insults lost their subtlety. They became blunt instruments of cruelty. One day, my trembling hands caused me to knock over a glass of water in the shed. When Sarah came in with a rag, she muttered just loud enough for me to hear, "Clumsy old woman." After that, the names became a part of my daily life, a constant abrasive soundtrack to my existence. Useless old hag, freeloader. They were dropped casually, sometimes with a smirk, sometimes with a sneer, as they passed me in the yard. Rick, the boy whose sweet, milky breath I remembered on my neck as I sang him lullabies, was the one whose words cut the deepest. "Just stop it, Mom," he snapped one day when I tried to ask a simple question about his job search. "Your job is to sit still and not cause any more trouble." Every word was a fresh wound, invisible but agonizingly deep. They were stripping me of my name, my identity, and replacing it with their own contemptuous, hateful labels. I began to confine myself to the shed, even when the door was unlocked. It had become a refuge of sorts, the only place I could cry without their scornful eyes on me. I'd sit on the lumpy mattress for hours, clutching my mother's Bible to my chest, and let the silent tears flow. I cried for my husband, John, whose quiet strength would have been a bulwark against this cruelty. I cried for the son I had lost, the kind, loving boy who had been replaced by this cold, hard stranger, and I cried for myself, for the foolish, trusting old woman who had traded her life for a lie. My mind would drift back to my old church back home, to the potlucks and the Bible studies, where the other women would greet me with a warm, "Hello, Sister Margaret." There, I had a name. I had a place. I had respect. Here, I was just an unwanted presence, a piece of old furniture to be tolerated. The contrast was a shard of glass working its way deeper into my heart. In my darkest moments, when the despair threatened to swallow me whole, my thoughts turned again and again to a woman I'd long admired, a woman whose words had been a source of strength for me throughout my life, Maya Angelou. I had read all of her books, and one of her quotes came back to me then, clear as a bell in the lonely silence of the shed. "You may not control all the events that happen to you, but you can decide not to be reduced by them." The words echoed in the hollow space around me. I couldn't control Rick and Sarah's cruelty. I couldn't change the cold, hard reality of my circumstances, but I could choose not to let their venom define me. I was not useless. I was not a freeloader. I was Margaret, a wife, a mother, a registered nurse who had dedicated 45 years of her life to caring for the sick and the dying. I had value. I had a history. I began to repeat the quote to myself, first aloud, then silently. It became a prayer, a mantra, a shield. It didn't erase the pain, not at all, but it gave me a small, protected space within myself, a place to protect the very core of my soul from their relentless assault. There was a small, cracked mirror hanging on a nail in the shed. For weeks, I had avoided looking at it, afraid of the defeated woman I would see. But after days of repeating Maya Angelou's words to myself, I finally found the courage to face my own reflection. I saw what I expected to see, an old woman, her hair gone white and thin, her face etched with lines of grief, her eyes puffy and red from countless unshed tears. But as I looked closer, past the surface of sorrow, deeper into the eyes staring back at me, I saw something else. It wasn't defeat, it was resilience. It was the look of a woman who had weathered storms before, the loss of her parents, the sudden heart-shattering death of her husband, the life and death struggles she had witnessed and fought alongside her patients in the hospital wards. I had survived all of that. I would not be destroyed by this petty, grubby cruelty. I reached up and traced the crack in the glass with my finger, as if touching my own wounds, acknowledging their existence. And I made a silent promise to that weary face in the mirror. I would not let myself break. I would bend, yes, but I would not break. I kept a small dark wood jewelry box, a gift from John on our 10th anniversary. It held no great valuables, no diamonds or pearls, but it was filled with memories. The most precious thing inside was my husband John's wedding band. It was a simple, plain gold ring, worn smooth with the years. He never took it off, not until the very last day of his life, when the nurse had gently slipped it from his finger and given it to me. I kept it safe in a small royal blue velvet pouch. One morning, a strange, prickling sense of dread, a cold premonition, urged me to check on it. I opened the box. My heart stopped. The little blue velvet pouch was there, but it felt light, empty. With trembling fingers, I pulled open the drawstring. It was empty. The ring was gone. A frantic, desperate energy seized me. I tore through the box, dumping its meager contents onto the dusty floorboards. I sifted through the tangle of old brooches and costume pearls. It was useless. The shed, which had become my sanctuary, suddenly felt violated, colder, emptier. That ring wasn't just a piece of metal. It was a sacred vow made tangible, the last physical piece of the greatest love of my life. Someone had come in here, into my private space, into my past, and stolen the most sacred part of it. Though my hands were shaking and my heart was a wild bird beating against my ribs, I knew I had to ask. I walked to the main house, my steps heavy, and found Sarah in the kitchen, painting her fingernails a garish, glittering shade of red. I forced my voice to remain steady. "Sarah, have you seen John's ring? It was in my jewelry box in the shed." She blew on her nails gently, a picture of casual indifference, before looking up at me. Her eyes were a perfect blank slate. "What ring? I have no idea. You probably misplaced it, Margaret. You've been so forgetful lately." The lie was so bald-faced, so effortless, it stole the air from my lungs. She was using my age against me again, wielding it like a weapon, painting me as a senile, incompetent old woman. I stared into her eyes, searching for any flicker of guilt, any sign of a soul, but there was nothing. Only a cold, empty void. I knew it was pointless to argue, my word against hers. I turned and walked away, a wave of profound helplessness washing over me. They weren't just taking my things. They were taking my credibility, erasing my history, stealing my very sanity. A few days later, a couple came to visit. Friends of theirs, I assumed. They sat on the front porch, the four of them, drinking tall glasses of iced tea and laughing loudly in the afternoon sun. I watched from the shadows of my shed, a ghost at the edge of their bright, cheerful world. Sarah threw her head back in laughter at some joke, bringing a hand up to her mouth to cover a delicate laugh. And in that moment, the breath caught in my throat, and my heart felt as if it were being squeezed by an icy felt. The afternoon sun glinted off something gold, something sparkling against the skin of her throat. She was wearing a new necklace, a delicate gold chain, and hanging from it, unmistakable in the clear light, was John's wedding band. She was wearing my memories. She was wearing my love, my grief, my sacred past as a cheap, fashionable trinket. Rage, pure and hot and bitter, surged through me with the force of a physical blow. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run out there and rip it from her neck, but my feet felt nailed to the dirt floor. I could only stand there, hidden in the darkness, and watch as she desecrated the most sacred thing I owned, laughing as she did it. That night, sleep was an impossible dream. The image of the ring, his ring, against her skin was burned into the back of my eyelids. I sat up, and by the light of a small candle, I pulled out my old photo album, one of the few things they hadn't touched. I turned the stiff black pages. There was our wedding photo, John looking so impossibly young and handsome and nervous as he slipped that very ring onto my finger. There was a picture of Rick as a newborn, his tiny, perfect hand wrapped around his father's finger, right around that worn gold band. It was in every picture, a silent, constant witness to our life together. I began to weep, not for the loss of a valuable object, but for the sheer, absolute contempt of the act. Sarah's wearing that ring was a declaration, a final, brutal statement. Your past, your love, your history, it has no value. It is all ours now, to do with as we please. My mind drifted to the old lazy boy recliner we'd had in our city apartment. It was John's throne. Every evening, without fail, he'd sit there watching PBS, his feet propped up, a cup of tea on the side table. After he died, I couldn't bring myself to get rid of it. Sometimes I would sit in it, just to feel the familiar worn leather, to feel the ghost of his presence, as if his quiet strength had soaked into the very fabric of the chair. When we were selling the apartment, Rick and Sarah had insisted, absolutely insisted, on throwing it out, calling it bulky and old-fashioned. I had fought them, tooth and nail, and finally arranged to give it to a kind neighbor. Now, sitting in the cold shed, I wished with all my heart that I had that chair. I craved its solid, comforting presence. The theft of the ring made me realize it was all part of a deliberate, cruel pattern. They had been systematically stripping away every single connection to my past, from large, comforting objects like the chair to small, sacred things like the ring. They wanted to make me a blank slate, a person with no history, no memories, all the better to control and discard me. The next morning, the grief had hardened into something else. It wasn't hatred. Hatred was a hot, messy emotion, and what I felt was cold and clear and sharp as glass. It was resolve. They could take my money. They could steal my husband's ring. But they could not take my love for him. That memory was mine and mine alone. I stepped outside and walked to the old gnarled oak tree at the edge of the property, the one place I felt a sliver of peace. I placed my hand on its rough, steady bark, as if drawing strength from its deep roots, and I whispered a promise to my late husband, my words carried away on the cool morning breeze. I won't let them dishonor you anymore, John. I won't let them win. I had no idea what I would do or how I would do it, but in that quiet moment, a silent war had been declared, a war to protect the honor of the dead and the soul of the living. A few evenings later, Rick and Sarah called me into the main house. The moment I stepped inside, I felt it. The atmosphere was strange, charged with a tense, purposeful energy I couldn't yet name. On the polished surface of the dining table, instead of plates of food, there was a thick file folder. Rick, avoiding my eyes, pushed it toward me across the table. "Sign this, Mom," he said, his voice completely flat, stripped of any emotion. "We're selling the back acreage. We got a good offer." I felt the blood drain from my face, a cold, sickening rush. That land, the back acreage, that was where John had spent the last, best years of his life, patiently planting a small orchard of apple and pear trees. It was his sanctuary, the place he said he felt closest to God. It wasn't just dirt and trees, it was a piece of his soul, a living testament to his love for the earth. I looked from the papers to Rick's face, then to Sarah's, who was watching me with a hawk-like intensity. I saw the undisguised, hungry greed in their eyes. They didn't see an orchard, a legacy of a good man's labor. They saw dollar signs. They saw a new car, a vacation, an escape. "I won't sign," I said. My voice was quiet, but in the oppressive, waiting silence of the room, it felt as loud as a gunshot. Sarah broke the silence first, her voice sharp with disbelief. "What do you mean you won't sign? It's just a piece of overgrown land, Margaret." I shook my head, a slow, deliberate movement. "To you, maybe, but to me, it's a memory." Rick slapped his hand lightly on the table, a gesture of sharp, barely controlled impatience. "Don't be so stubborn, Mom. We need the money. You live here, you're part of this family, you have to contribute." He was using the very idea of family, the concept he had destroyed, to blackmail me into giving up our family's legacy. My hands, resting on the tabletop, began to tremble, not from fear, but from a slow-burning, righteous rage that was finally finding its voice. I looked directly into Rick's eyes, my son's eyes. I searched for the little boy who had cried, his face buried in my lap, when his pet bird died. I searched for the teenager who had been so proud to get his driver's license, who had promised me he would always drive safe. I searched for the man who had wept at his father's funeral. I found nothing. His eyes were cold, distant, and utterly foreign. They were the eyes of a businessman looking at an obstacle, an asset to be liquidated. And in that instant, the most painful, liberating truth of all became crystal clear. My love couldn't save him. The greed, the fear, it had consumed him whole, hollowing him out and turning him into a stranger. I stood up, my movements feeling slow and deliberate. With one hand, I pushed the folder back across the polished table toward them. "My answer is no." I turned and walked toward the door, each step feeling heavy as lead, as if I were wading through deep water. I could feel their furious, menacing stares boring into my back, a physical pressure. The war was no longer silent. That night, sleep was a distant country I couldn't reach. I sat by the shed window, looking out at the land, at John's orchard, bathed in the pale, ethereal light of the moon. I could almost see his ghost walking among the young trees he had planted with such care and hope. I began to whisper to him, telling him everything as if he were right there beside me in the cold, dark shed. "They want to take your land, John," I said, the tears finally coming, tracing hot paths down my cold cheeks. "They want to sell your dream, but I won't let them. I promise you." Talking to him, even to his memory, made me feel stronger, less alone. This land wasn't mine to give away. I was its keeper, its guardian, the keeper of a memory, of a legacy for future generations, even if the current one seemed so profoundly unworthy. That whisper in the dark, that promise to my dead husband, became an ironclad vow in my heart. I thought about other families, about the legacies they passed down, the invisible threads that bind them together. Sometimes it's a well-loved recipe for meatballs, or a grandfather's old, battered watch, or a silly joke told over and over at every holiday gathering. They aren't worth much in terms of money, but they are priceless. They are the threads that connect us to our past, that shape who we are. They are the tangible proof that we have loved and been loved. That land, that orchard, was our legacy. It was the story of John's quiet love for the earth, his simple dream of a peaceful life. Selling it would be worse than burning a photo album. It would be erasing a piece of our family's soul. Thinking of this, I wonder, doesn't every family have a piece of land like that? It might be an object, a home, or just a memory that can't be bought or sold. What's the most precious legacy you're keeping safe for your family? I'd love to hear your story in the comments below. It would mean a lot to know I'm not alone in these thoughts. The retaliation, when it came, was swift and brutal. The next evening, no one called me for dinner. The familiar gnawing hunger pang started, sharp and insistent. I waited, huddled in my thin blanket, telling myself they were just trying to scare me. It wasn't until late at night, when the moon was high and cold in the sky, that the shed door creaked open. Sarah stood there, a dark silhouette against the bright porch light of the main house, a plate in her hand. She didn't hand it to me. She didn't even set it down. She threw it onto the dirt floor with a clatter. "If you won't be helpful," she hissed, her voice a venomous whisper that cut through the night's quiet, "then maybe you don't need to eat." On the plate was a small congealed pile of cold, greasy leftovers, something scraped from their plates. She slammed the door shut. A dry, final-sounding click echoed in the darkness, a sound I hadn't heard before. I scrambled to the door, my heart pounding, and twisted the knob. It didn't budge. I rattled it, pushed against the door with all my might. Nothing. They had locked me in from the outside. I stood in the pitch black, my hand still on the useless knob, staring at the plate of food on the floor, and for the first time a real physical primal fear took hold of me. This was no longer just about cruelty. This was about something much, much darker. Chắc chắn rồi, tôi sẽ tiếp tục chính xác từ điểm đã dừng, hoàn thiện câu chuyện bằng cách mở rộng chiều sâu nội tâm và mô tả chi tiết để đáp ứng yêu cầu về độ dài, phong hồn từ, đồng thời giữ nguyên giống văn và tất cả các chi dẫn đã được thống nhất. The sound of the deadbolt sliding into place was more terrifying than any curse. It was not a loud sound, just a dry, metallic scrape, followed by a solid thud of finality. It was a sound that transformed my squalid shelter into a cell. For a moment, I just stood there, my hand still on the useless knob, unable to process it. Then a primal panic seized me. I beat against the rough wood of the door with both fists, the shock giving way to a frantic, desperate energy. "Rick! Sarah! Let me out! What are you doing?" I screamed, my voice cracking. I pounded until my knuckles were raw, until the bones in my hands ached. But my cries were answered only by the chirping of crickets and the vast, indifferent silence of the Montana night. I pressed my ear to the door, listening, praying for the sound of footsteps returning. for the scrape of the bolt being drawn back, for this to be some kind of cruel momentary joke. But all I heard was the sound of their footsteps retreating, the solid thud of the main house door closing, and then nothing. They had left me, locked in. The feeling of being imprisoned by the child I had brought into this world, the child I had loved more than my own life, was a horror beyond words. The invisible walls they had been building around me for months were now brutally, terrifyingly real. I didn't touch the food on the floor. The hunger was a gnawing beast inside me, a twisting, cramping pain in my belly. But my dignity, what little I had left, was stronger. I would not eat like an animal. I would not eat their scraps from the floor. I sat on the edge of the lumpy mattress, my back ramrod straight, my hands clenched in my lap, trying to ignore the cramping in my stomach. I closed my eyes, and in an act of sheer will, I pictured a proper meal. I remembered a Thanksgiving dinner from years ago, when John was still alive and Rick was home from college. I summoned the memory of a golden brown roasted turkey, its skin crisp, the steam rising as John carved it. I remembered the creamy mashed potatoes, the tangy cranberry sauce, and a slice of warm pumpkin pie with a dollop of fresh whipped cream. I tried to summon the memory of being full, warm, and surrounded by love. Memory was my supper that night. But when I opened my eyes, the cruel reality was still there. The suffocating darkness, the seeping cold, and the plate of leftovers mocking me from the floor. The rural silence, which I had once thought might be peaceful, was no longer my friend. It was menacing, filled with sounds that made my city dwellers' blood run cold. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves in the wind made me jump, my heart leaping into my throat. And then I heard it. A long, mournful howl that rose and fell in the distance, a sound of pure, wild loneliness. A coyote. Then another answered, closer this time. The hairs on my arms stood on end. They knew there were predators out here. That deadbolt on the outside of the door, which Rick had once claimed was to keep you safe, Mom, now had a sinister, horrifying new meaning. It wasn't to keep predators out, it was to keep me in. If something happened, a fire, a medical emergency, one of those coyotes becoming bold, I was trapped. Their neglect, their cruelty had escalated into a potentially lethal act. When the first pale fingers of dawn crept through the cracks in the wall, I was exhausted, but I had not slept. I had spent the entire night sitting bolt upright, listening, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The door remained shut. No one came. They were really going to do it. They were going to starve me into submission. I looked around my cell in the thin gray light. It was grim and dirty, a place of despair, but it was mine. I forced myself to stand, my joints protesting, and began to pace, to get the blood flowing in my numb legs. I would not just sit here and wait to die. I began to observe. I studied everything. The warped plank walls, the packed earth floor, the tiny grime-caked window set high above my head. I started looking for a way out, for a weakness, for any small ray of hope. The worried, grieving mother was gone. In her place was a survivor. There was an old, rusted spigot in the corner of the shed that dripped slowly, incessantly. For weeks, I had found the sound irritating, a constant reminder of the shed's decay. Now, it was the most beautiful sound in the world. It was the sound of life. I found an old, dented coffee can left behind by some previous occupant and placed it underneath the drip. Plink, plink, plink. Waiting for it to collect enough water for a sip was a profound lesson in patience. Each drop felt like a gift. When I had collected enough for a small mouthful, I drank it slowly, savoring the cool metallic taste. The water soothed my parched throat and gave me a sliver of strength, a feeling of agency. In that moment, I realized how my world had been turned upside down. The things I had always taken for granted, a hot meal, a clean glass of water, the simple freedom to walk out a door, were now unattainable luxuries. The deprivation was agonizing, but it was also forging something new in me, a will of iron. Around noon, I heard the familiar, deep rumble of Rick's pickup truck starting up. A tiny, treacherous flicker of hope ignited in my chest. Maybe he'd had a change of heart. Maybe his conscience had gotten the better of him. Maybe he was coming to let me out. I rushed to the door and called his name, my voice hoarse and weak. Rick! Rick, it's Mom! Please! I heard the engine idle for a long moment. A heavy, loaded silence hung in the air. In that silence, I imagined him sitting in the driver's seat, his hand on the key, warring with himself. Please, Rick, I prayed. Remember who you are. Remember me. Then the engine revved, a decisive, angry sound, and the noise of the truck faded as he drove away down the long gravel road. He had heard me. I was certain of it. He had heard his mother's cry for help, and he had made a choice. He had chosen to drive away. It was the final, brutal confirmation. There were no more ambiguities, no more excuses to be made for him. In his heart, I was not his mother anymore. I was a problem to be solved, an obstacle to be removed. The pain of that truth was a physical blow, worse than the hunger, worse than the cold. But with the pain came a strange, quiet kind of release. I no longer had to hope. I no longer had to wait for his mercy. I knew now, with absolute certainty, that I was on my own. After Rick drove away, the storm of rage and grief and betrayal inside me finally subsided, leaving behind a strange, profound calm. The tears were gone. I felt as if I had none left to cry. I sat on the cold dirt floor, my back against the rough plank wall, and just breathed. In, out, a slow, steady rhythm. I expected nothing from them anymore. Every last illusion of family, every lingering ember of a mother's love for that stranger in the main house had been extinguished. And in that shattering, I found a kind of freedom. Freedom from the burden of love, freedom from the shackles of hope. I was no longer a mother grieving a lost son. I was simply Margaret, a human being facing a trial of survival. Not unlike the first pioneers who came to this beautiful, unforgiving Montana land with nothing but their own two hands and an unbending will to live. My mind went back to Maya Angelou, to a poem I had read long ago, a poem that had settled deep in my bones. It was about a caged bird. Its wings were clipped and its feet were tied, but still the caged bird sang. It sang of freedom, of things unknown but longed for still. I was that bird. They could lock my door, take my money, hurl insults at me until my spirit was bruised and raw. But they couldn't take my inner voice. They couldn't stop me from praying, from remembering my husband, from willing myself to live. I began to hum an old hymn, one my mother used to sing in the kitchen, Amazing Grace. The familiar melody, frail and wavering at first, filled the cramped, cold space. It was a quiet act of defiance, a sound of life in a place of death. And for the first time in days, I felt a measure of peace settle over me. My song was my rebellion. I decided I needed a routine, a structure to keep my mind from descending into the chaos of despair. A schedule was a shield against hopelessness. So, every morning, when the first light came, I continued my ritual of cleaning the small window, a symbolic act of clearing my own vision. Every afternoon, I paced the length of the shed, 10 laps, then 20, then 50, forcing my body to move, refusing to let it stiffen and fail. And every evening, I would sit in the one spot where the setting sun cast a single golden bar of light through a crack in the wall. I would sit in that patch of light, close my eyes, and feel its faint, fleeting warmth on my skin. It became my sacred ritual, my daily appointment with the outside world. It was a reminder that even though I was a prisoner, the sun still rose and set, and life, beautiful and relentless, went on. And I had to survive to be a part of it again. The hunger and the loneliness were constant, relentless companions. To keep my mind from surrendering, I played a game with myself. I would try to recall a happy memory in the most vivid sensory detail possible. I would close my eyes and transport myself. I remembered a fishing trip with John on Flathead Lake, the shocking, thrilling tug of a trout on the line, the spray of cold water on my face, the taste of the fish cooked over an open fire that evening. I remembered the smell of my mother's gingerbread cookies baking at Christmas, a warm, spicy scent that meant love and safety. I remembered the look of pure, unadulterated pride on Rick's face on his college graduation day, his eyes shining, before life and ambition and Sarah had curdled him. The memories were bittersweet, a beautiful ache in my heart, but they were my proof of a life fully lived. I was not a nobody. I was not a burden. I had loved, and I had been loved. I had lived, and no one, not even the sun who had locked me in this shed, could take that away from me. It's in times like these, I realize, that the smallest things can hold us up. A patch of sunlight on a dirt floor, an old hymn sung in the dark, a beautiful memory. Is there a small ritual or a simple joy that has ever helped you through a difficult time? I would truly love to hear your stories. It would mean a lot to know I'm not alone in these thoughts. One morning, I woke to a different kind of cold. Not the usual damp chill of the shed, but a sharp, biting cold that seemed to have teeth, a cold that promised worse to come. I looked out my clean window and saw that the world had been transformed overnight. A delicate, crystalline layer of white frost coated every blade of grass, every branch of the distant trees, sparkling in the early morning sun. Winter was coming, and in Montana, winter is no joke. It does not arrive gently. It arrives like an invading army. I looked at the old, rickety space heater mounted on the wall, a fragile-looking thing of rust and wires. A new, more practical, more primal fear began to take root in my mind. My battle was no longer just with Rick and Sarah. Soon, I would be facing a much larger, more impartial, and more ruthless enemy, the elements. That night, as my breath began to cloud in the frigid air, I knelt by my mattress. The floor was so cold, it felt like kneeling on a block of ice. I didn't pray for rescue. I didn't pray for vengeance on my captors. I prayed only for strength. Lord, I whispered, my words small puffs of white in the darkness. Let me not die in bitterness. Let me not die in hatred. Whatever comes, please just let me face it with dignity and with courage. The prayer didn't warm the room, but it warmed the cold, frightened space inside my soul. I knew, with a certainty that went deeper than thought, that I was not alone in this fight. I had my faith, and I had myself, and that would have to be enough. It started as a low, mournful whistle of wind around the corners of the shed. Within a few hours, the whistle became a growl, then an enraged, screaming roar. The first blizzard of the season had arrived, and it had come with a terrifying fury. It was nothing like the city storms I was used to, where the wind was buffered by tall buildings. Out here, on the open, unprotected plains, there was nothing to stop its raw power. The wind slammed against the shed, shaking the whole rickety structure until I thought it would splinter apart and be carried away. It felt as if a great, angry beast was clawing at the walls, trying to get in. I huddled under my single thin blanket, which offered almost no protection, listening to nature's violent symphony, feeling the terrifying fragility of my own small, warm life in the face of such overwhelming force. Then the snow began. At first, it was just gentle, almost magical flakes dancing in the air, but soon they became a thick, blinding torrent, a solid wall of white that erased the world. My little window, my single precious connection to the outside, slowly began to disappear under the drifting snow. First, the bottom half was covered, then 3/4, then it was gone completely. I was being buried. The weak daylight vanished, replaced by a dim, eerie twilight that filtered through the cracks in the walls. The feeling of imprisonment was now absolute. I wasn't just locked in a room. I was being entombed in snow. As I had feared, the old space heater, my only source of warmth, gave out. It sputtered, rattled violently for a moment, coughed out one last, pathetic puff of lukewarm air, and then fell silent with a final, decisive click. I stumbled over to it in the near darkness and banged on its side a few times. A useless, desperate gesture. It was dead. The temperature in the shed began to plummet at an alarming rate. This was no longer just uncomfortable cold. This was a dangerous, life-threatening cold. I put on every single piece of clothing I had, layering shirts and sweaters until I could barely move, but it did little to stop the penetrating, insidious chill. It seeped through the fabric, into my skin, and began to steal the last of my precious body heat. My body started to rebel. My fingers and toes were the first to go, growing numb and then aching with a deep, searing, burning pain. I tried to rub them, to force some life back into them, but my hands were stiff and clumsy as blocks of wood. I knew the signs of hypothermia all too well. As a nurse, I had seen it before in the homeless and the unfortunate. First, the uncontrollable shivering, then confusion and slurred speech, and then the final, deceptive, lethal feeling of drowsiness. The shivering started, a violent full-body tremor that rattled my teeth together so hard I was afraid they would break. I knew, with the part of my mind that was still clear and clinical, that I couldn't let myself sleep. To sleep now would be to die. I forced myself to move. I stood up and paced the tiny space, a shambling, painful rhythm in the darkness. I talked to myself, reciting Bible verses I knew by heart, the names of all the states in alphabetical order, anything to keep my mind alert, to fight off the sweet, lethal temptation of sleep. Watch and pray, a verse came to me, and the words took on a new, primal meaning. My fight was no longer about dignity or legacy or betrayal. It was the most basic, ancient struggle of all, the fight to stay alive. right here, in this freezing, dark tomb. I knew I couldn't last much longer. My energy was fading fast. The violent shivering began to subside, a dangerous sign that my body was shutting down, giving up the fight. With a final, desperate surge of will, I staggered to the door and beat against it with the heels of my hands. The sound was weak, pathetic, almost lost in the howling, screaming wind. "Help! Help me!" I rasped, my voice a dry, broken croak. I wasn't calling for Rick anymore. I was just pleading with the universe, with God, with any force that might hear me. I pounded until my hands were numb and useless, until I had no strength left at all. Then I slid down the rough wood of the door to the frozen floor, curled into a tight ball, and waited for the end. Just as I felt myself slipping away, drifting into that final, dark, quiet sleep, I heard a sound that was not the wind, the metallic scrape of the deadbolt being drawn back. The door opened a crack, no more than a few inches. A blast of Arctic air, like 1,000 tiny sharp needles, stabbed at my face, shocking me back to a state of semi-awareness. Through the opening, I saw a figure, a dark shape against the swirling white of the blizzard. It was Rick. He stood there, bundled in a heavy winter coat, his own breath pluming in the frigid air. He didn't come in. He just stood and looked down at me, curled on the floor like a dying animal. There was no pity in his eyes, no concern, no flicker of love, only obtained hard calculation. "Cold, Mom?" His voice was flat, cruel, cutting through the scream of the wind with an unnatural calm. I couldn't answer. I could only stare up at him, my mind struggling to form a thought. "Heater's broken," he stated, as if discussing a minor inconvenience. "Plumber won't come out in a storm like this. It's not an emergency, see, unless it is an emergency." He paused, letting his words hang in the freezing air, letting them sink into my numb, slow-moving brain. I understood. He was making a deal. He was laying out his terms. My life for my signature. My own son, the child I had nursed and raised and loved with every fiber of my being, was calmly, rationally bartering for my life. He pushed the familiar file folder through the crack in the door. It landed on the floor beside me with a soft thud. "Sign the land sale papers," he said, his voice as cold and hard as the ice forming on the walls. "Then we'll call the plumber. We'll tell him it's an emergency. A burst pipe. They'll come right away for that." I looked at the papers, then back at his face, a pale, merciless mask in the gloom. This was it, the final choice. My husband's legacy or my own life. He wasn't just letting me freeze to death through neglect. He was actively, consciously using my imminent death as a weapon, as a tool of extortion. In that horrifying moment, as I lay dying on the floor at his feet, something inside me snapped. The fear vanished. It was replaced by a painful, piercing, absolute clarity. The son I loved, the boy I had held out a sliver of hope for, the child whose memory I had clung to, was well and truly gone. He had died long ago, and this cold, hard thing was all that was left. The person standing before me was a stranger, a predator, a monster. And as I accepted that final, brutal truth, the mother in me, the part that had loved him unconditionally for 40 years, died. There were no tears, no grief, just a cold, empty, quiet space where that boundless love used to be. I owed this person nothing. My body was stiff, my movements agonizingly slow. With a groan, I struggled to push myself up into a sitting position. "All right," I whispered, my voice a dry, rasping thing, barely audible over the wind. "Get me a pen." A flicker of a smile, a cold, triumphant smirk, touched Rick's lips. He thought he'd won. He thought the fear of death had finally broken me. He didn't know that in this final hour of despair, I hadn't found surrender. I had found something else entirely. I had found freedom. The freedom to do whatever it took to survive, not as his mother, but as Margaret. Rick disappeared for a moment. Then the door opened a crack again. He pushed a pen and a small, powerful flashlight through the opening. "Hurry up," he urged, his voice tight with impatience. The flashlight beam danced across my face, blinding me. With numb, clumsy, useless-feeling fingers, I took the pen. I looked down at the contract on the floor. This was the end of one road, and perhaps, if God was willing, the beginning of another. I took a deep, shuddering breath, the icy air burning my lungs like fire. I was not going to die here. Not tonight. Not like this. My silent war was about to end, and one final, desperate battle was about to begin. I held the pen in my hand. In my weakened state, it felt impossibly heavy. Rick kept the flashlight beam steady on the contract, the bright circle of light illuminating the stark, black print. "Sign on the bottom line," he commanded from the other side of the door. I bent over the papers, making a show of squinting, pretending to read the legal jargon. My heart was pounding against my ribs, a frantic, wild rhythm, but it was not from fear. It was from a surge of pure, unadulterated adrenaline. In my days of captivity, in my endless, monotonous pacing, I had become an observer of my prison. I had studied its every flaw, its every weakness, and I had found one. A small, overlooked detail that a man as arrogant and confident as Rick would never have noticed. This pen, this simple ballpoint pen, was my key. Not to sign my name, but to unlock my cage. I can't see properly," I said, forcing a convincing tremble into my already weak voice. "The light is too bright. It's hurting my eyes. And I need a drink of water. My throat is so dry, I can hardly swallow." I heard Rick let out an exasperated, angry sigh from the other side of the door, but he wanted that signature more than anything. "Fine," he snapped. "Don't move. I'll be right back." He slammed the door shut, and in his haste, in his moment of triumph, I heard what I had been praying to hear. He didn't slide the deadbolt home. He was just going back to the house for a glass of water. This was it, my chance. I had minutes, maybe only seconds. I could not fail. I crawled toward the bottom of the door, ignoring the contract completely. Near the floor, by the rusty hinges, was a small, simple iron hasp that was meant to slide into a loop on the frame, secured by a pin. It was an old, secondary lock. During my endless, obsessive pacing, I had noticed that the wood around the loop was old and soft, and the hasp itself was loose from years of neglect. I realized that if I had something hard and thin, something I could use as a lever, I might be able to pry the pin out of the loop. The door would still be locked at the knob higher up, but the bottom would swing free, just enough. Rick and Sarah, in their cruel, stupid confidence, had focused on the modern deadbolt, the symbol of their power, and had completely ignored this small, fundamental weakness. They thought a weak, dying old woman was no threat. They had underestimated me. There was no time to waste. I jammed the metal tip of the ballpoint pen into the small space by the hasp's pin, using every ounce of my remaining, desperate strength to pry it up. My fingers were numb and useless as frozen sticks. The pen slipped once, its tip scraping loudly against the metal. My heart seized. I heard the sound of footsteps crunching in the snow outside, coming back. He was faster than I thought. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. I took one more deep, shuddering breath, uttered a silent, fervent prayer, and tried one last time, leveraging the pen with the weight of my body. There was a faint, satisfying pop. The pen came free. The bottom of the door swung inward, creating a gap no wider than my hand. It was enough. I dropped the pen, abandoned the contract on the dirt floor, and squeezed my aching, protesting body through the opening, out into the raging blizzard. I ran out into the white chaos of the storm. I had no coat, only the thin layers of clothes I was wearing, but the fire of adrenaline and the raw, screaming will to live burned away the cold. I didn't run for the main road. I knew they would look for me there. I ran toward my husband's land, toward the shelter of his orchard. I knew that at the far end of the property, hidden by a line of pine trees, there was a small, overgrown trail, used only by locals, that led out to a different, less traveled road. The snow was deep, up to my knees in places, and every step was a monumental effort, but I didn't stop. Behind me, I heard Rick's enraged scream as he returned to find the shed empty. His voice, thin and furious, was quickly swallowed by the howling wind. He sounded like a cornered animal, a predator who had just watched its prey escape the trap. I don't know how long I walked, stumbling through the deep snow, my body screaming in protest, my mind focused on a single point: survival. But then, through the swirling, blinding blizzard, I saw them. Two faint, beautiful points of yellow light, the headlights of a truck. I waved my arms, screamed with what little was left of my voice. The truck slowed and stopped. A kind-faced farmer, a stranger, helped me into the warm cab of his truck, wrapped me in a rough, dry horse blanket, and drove me to the sheriff's office in the nearest town. Sitting there, in the warm, brightly lit office, wrapped in a thick wool blanket, sipping the hottest, sweetest, most wonderful coffee I had ever tasted in my life, I knew I was safe. I knew my story was finally being heard. They hadn't won. They hadn't taken everything. They hadn't taken my faith. They hadn't taken my memories. And most importantly, they hadn't taken my will to live. They had left me with nothing, and in doing so, they had given me back myself. Finding my voice that day was one thing, but sharing my story and knowing someone is truly listening, that's a different kind of healing altogether. I know that when we sit down together, stories often just pour out like a stream. Today, I wanted to open my heart to you, and I truly hope I can hear your stories in return. You know, sometimes it's just a simple click on a screen. A like, a subscribe, or a share might seem like a small, fleeting gesture to many. But to me, and to all the quiet voices that need to be shared, each one of those clicks is a small light in the darkness. It's a quiet way of saying, I see you, I hear you, your story matters. It reminds me that we are not invisible. Just a simple click from you is a powerful statement of support for me, and it's the motivation that keeps me sharing these stories. After my story was told, something changed in me. For weeks, all I wanted was for someone to listen to what was in my heart. And now that you have listened, I realize that what I want most is to listen to what is in yours. Down below, in that comment section, I would be so honored if you would share a piece of your story with me. Tell me about a time you felt unheard. Tell me about a passion that others might have thought was silly. Or tell me about a moment you found your strength, even in the smallest, most quiet way. I will read them. I will carry them with me because your story matters. We want to build Sapphire Revenge into a community where we can share the stories from the bottom of our hearts. I know that you too have private stories that can sometimes be difficult to share with family or friends. I'm here to listen, to share in your joys and sorrows, because we all have the right to be respected and to be heard. If you don't have a sad story like the one I've been through, then please share your happy ones. Tell me about a joy you experienced today. Please share it with me. It will be a powerful source of motivation, helping me and the other viewers watching this to heal, to find faith, and to find strength in our own lives. If you happen to be watching this on a television, please don't hesitate to pick up your phone and search for my channel, Sapphire Revenge. I truly hope to share these feelings with you. Let's build a community together where we can share our truest emotions. Let's make this a place where we listen to each other. A place where no woman has to feel that her life, her struggles, and her triumphs are invisible. Thank you once again for sitting with me. It means the world.